The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet corridors of St. Mary's Children's Hospital on a chilly winter evening. Outside, snowflakes danced gently in the air, creating a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted with the serious work happening within the hospital walls. The clock had just struck 9 p.m., and the night shift was settling in for what everyone expected to be a routine evening. At the main entrance, the automatic doors whooshed open and closed as usual, letting in the occasional gust of cold air. Nurse Mei Lin sat at the reception desk, organizing patient files while sipping her still-warm green tea. She had worked at St. Mary's for over 15 years, and she thought she'd seen everything there was to see in a hospital. She was wrong. The first sign that something unusual was about to happen came when the automatic doors opened, but no person walked through. Mai looked up from her paperwork, expecting to see someone hesitating at the entrance. Instead, her eyes widened as she watched a large, silver-gray husky slip through the doors with surprising grace. The dog's fur gleamed under the hospital lights, but what caught Mai's attention were its eyes. They were an extraordinary shade of gold, unlike anything she'd ever seen on a dog before. For a moment, Mai sat frozen in her chair, her tea forgotten in her hands. The dog wasn't wearing a collar or any identification, and it definitely wasn't a service animal. They knew all the regular service dogs that visited the hospital. This one was different. It moved with an almost supernatural awareness of its surroundings, its paws making no sound on the polished floor. "Hey!" Mai finally called out, setting down her cup and standing up. But the dog didn't react like a normal stray would. It didn't bark, didn't run, and didn't even look scared. Instead, it turned its head slightly, those golden eyes meeting hers for just a second, and Mai felt a strange sensation wash over her, like the dog was trying to tell her something important. Before she could reach for the phone to call security, the mysterious animal trotted purposefully down the hallway, moving as if it knew exactly where it was going. Its behavior was so unusual that Mai found herself hesitating to raise the alarm immediately. The dog wasn't causing any chaos or showing any signs of aggression. In fact, it was cleaner and more well-behaved than some human visitors she'd seen. Down in the emergency room, Dr. Patel was just finishing up with a patient when he noticed the unusual visitor pass by the open door. He stepped into the hallway, clipboard in hand, and watched in amazement as the dog navigated the hospital corridors like it had a map. It passed by busy nurses, avoided rolling equipment carts, and even waited patiently when an elderly patient with a walker crossed its path. The security cameras tracked the dog's progress through the building, catching glimpses of its mysterious journey. In the surveillance room, night security guard Mr. Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair, watching the monitors with growing curiosity. In all his years working security, he'd never seen anything quite like this. The dog moved with such purpose, such intelligence, that it almost seemed human-like in its behavior. Hospital staff members who spotted the dog found themselves strangely reluctant to stop it. There was something about its presence that felt important, meaningful. A young orderly named Jun watched it wait for an elevator and swore later that the dog even pressed the button with its nose, though nobody quite believed that part of the story. The night shift workers began whispering to each other about the strange visitor. Word spread quickly through the hospital corridors, passed along in hushed tones from person to person. Some suggested calling animal control, while others felt they should wait and see what would happen. The dog's calm demeanor and obvious sense of purpose made them hesitate to intervene. As the mysterious animal made its way deeper into the hospital, the staff noticed something else unusual. Patients who caught a glimpse of it through their open doors seemed to feel better, even if just for a moment. An elderly man suffering from chronic pain smiled for the first time in days. A worried mother waiting for her son's test results felt an inexplicable sense of peace wash over her. The dog padded silently past the hospital chapel, where the soft glow of candles spilled into the hallway. Sister Marie, who had been arranging flowers for the morning service, caught sight of it and crossed herself, remembering old stories her grandmother used to tell about spirit animals who appeared in times of need. Meanwhile, up in the neonatal intensive care unit, nobody yet knew about the unusual visitor making its way through the hospital. The staff there was focused on their tiny patients, particularly concerned about one recent arrival who had been struggling. They had no idea that their unit was the dog's destination, or that they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the world. The silver-gray husky continued its journey, its golden eyes focused ahead, moving steadily closer to its mysterious purpose. The hospital's night shift would soon discover that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary story, one that would be told and retold for years to come, leaving everyone who witnessed it wondering about the true nature of miracles. Up in the neonatal intensive care unit, the world felt different from the rest of the hospital. Here the lights were dimmer, the voices softer, and every sound was muffled by the gentle hum of medical equipment. In one corner of the unit, Lucia Martinez hadn't moved from her chair for what felt like an eternity. Her eyes were fixed on the tiny form of her daughter Isabella, who lay in the incubator surrounded by tubes and monitoring wires. Isabella had arrived 8 weeks too early, weighing less than 4 pounds. She was so small that her father's wedding ring could slip all the way up to her shoulder. The nurses had warned Lucia that premature babies often face challenges, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of watching her child struggle to breathe. The steady beeping of the heart monitor had become both a comfort and a source of anxiety for Lucia. Each soft ping meant Isabella's heart was still fighting, still refusing to give up. But the numbers on the monitors weren't as encouraging as the doctors wanted them to be. Isabella's oxygen levels kept dropping, and no one could figure out why. "You need to rest," the night nurse, Mrs. Chen, had told her countless times. "You won't be any help to Isabella if you make yourself sick." But how could any mother sleep when her baby was fighting for every breath? Lucia had been running on coffee and prayer for the past 3 days, her hands cramping from the hours spent reaching through the incubator's ports to touch her daughter's tiny fingers. The other parents in the NICU understood. They shared knowing looks and kind words, united in their worry and hope. Mr. and Mrs. Patel, whose twins were in the next incubator, often brought her tea from the cafeteria. Tonight, they had finally gone home to rest. Promising to return in the morning with fresh samosas, Mrs. Patel insisted that new mothers needed proper food, not just hospital cafeteria sandwiches. As the night deepened, Lucia found herself talking to Isabella, telling her stories about the home and family waiting for her. She described the nursery that her grandmother had helped paint, with little yellow ducks waddling across the walls. She talked about her older brother Miguel, who asked every day when his baby sister was coming home. She promised Isabella about all the adventures they would have together if she would just keep fighting. "Your papa is painting a mural in your room," Lucia whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of talking. "He's an artist, you know. He's painting a big tree with all kinds of animals hiding in it. Every night he adds a new creature, saying each one is sending you strength." She wiped away tears with the sleeve of her sweater, trying to keep her voice steady. "Last night he painted a little hummingbird. He says it's to remind you that even the smallest things can be incredibly strong." The monitors beat steadily, but Isabella's oxygen levels had dropped again. Dr. Kumar had increased her support earlier, his kind eyes worried behind his glasses as he examined the latest test results. "We're doing everything we can," he had assured Lucia, but she could hear the concern in his voice. Isabella wasn't responding to the treatments as well as they had hoped. Outside the window, the snow was falling harder now. Lucia watched the flakes swirl in the darkness, creating patterns that blurred as her exhausted eyes struggled to stay open. The soft whoosh of the ventilator had become a lullaby she fought against, determined to stay awake for her daughter. Mrs. Chen appeared again, this time with a warm blanket and a fresh cup of chamomile tea. "Just rest for a moment," she urged, draping the blanket over Lucia's shoulders. "I'll watch her. I promise I'll wake you if anything changes." Her gentle touch reminded Lucia of her own mother, who was flying in from Mexico tomorrow. Perhaps that's why she finally allowed herself to lean back in the chair just for a moment. The weight of 3 sleepless nights pressed down on her, and Lucia felt her eyes growing heavier. She tried to focus on Isabella's tiny face, on the perfect bow of her lips and the dark eyelashes that looked just like her father's. "Mom is here, mi angelito," she murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." In the quiet of the NICU, other parents had dozed off too, creating a peaceful atmosphere broken only by the synchronized beeping of monitors and the soft footsteps of nurses doing their rounds. Nobody noticed when the automatic doors slid open with a quiet hiss. Nobody saw the strange visitor that had made its way through the hospital, finally arriving at its destination. The silver-gray husky with golden eyes padded silently into the unit, its presence about to change everything. As Lucia drifted into an exhausted sleep, but hands still reaching toward her daughter's incubator, she couldn't have known that help had arrived in the most unexpected form. The night was about to take an extraordinary turn, and hope was padding in on 4 quiet paws. The neonatal intensive care unit was bathed in soft blue light from the monitoring equipment when the mysterious visitor made its entrance. The automatic doors whispered open, and the silver-gray husky stepped into the sacred space where tiny lives hum in the balance. Its golden eyes seemed to glow in the dim lighting, reflecting the gentle pulse of the medical monitors. Nurse Chen was the first to notice the dog's presence. She had been updating charts at the central station when movement caught her eye. Her first instinct was alarm. Animals weren't allowed in the ICU, where premature babies were so vulnerable to infection. But something about this dog made her pause. It wasn't dirty or wild-looking. In fact, its fur seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly cleanliness, and it moved with deliberate care, as if understanding the delicacy of its surroundings. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, not wanting to wake the sleeping parents. Her hand moved toward the phone to call security, but she found herself watching instead as the dog made its way directly to little Isabella's incubator. The animal's paws made no sound on the polished floor. Even the usual click of nails was absent, as if it was floating rather than walking. Young Dr. Kapoor had just finished checking on the twins in the corner when he spotted the unexpected visitor. His mouth opened to raise an alarm, but the words died in his throat. The dog's behavior was unlike anything he'd seen in his years of medical training. It wasn't acting like a lost or confused animal. Instead, it moved with purpose, with awareness, almost like a doctor making rounds. The husky approached Isabella's incubator where Lucia still slept in her chair, her hand stretched out toward her daughter through the porthole. The dog sat down quietly, its posture perfect, its golden eyes fixed on the tiny baby struggling for life inside the clear plastic chamber. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. Other staff members had noticed now. 2 nurses stood frozen by the supply cabinet, watching. An orderly who had been mopping the floor leaned on his mop, transfixed. None of them moved to intervene. There was something happening here that felt bigger than hospital protocols and safety regulations. The dog's presence seemed to fill the room with a strange sense of peace. The usual beeping of monitors felt more distant, muffled, as if the world was holding its breath. Even the babies seemed to sense something was different. The twins who usually fussed during this hour were sleeping peacefully, and other infants turned their tiny heads toward the visitor, as if drawn to its presence. Then something extraordinary happened. The husky began to make a sound, not a bark or a whine, but a gentle humming that seemed to resonate at a frequency just at the edge of human hearing. It was like a lullaby without words, a song of comfort and healing that seemed to fill the air with warmth. The monitoring equipment attached to Isabella started to change. Her oxygen saturation levels, which had been worryingly low, began to climb. The irregular patterns on her heart monitor smoothed out into stronger, more stable rhythms. Inside the incubator, the baby who had been so still began to move, her tiny fingers flexing as if reaching out toward the strange visitor. Mrs. Chen took a step forward, her medical training warring with what she was witnessing. She'd worked in the ICU for 20 years, and had seen her share of unexpected recoveries, but nothing like this. The numbers on Isabella's monitors were improving more rapidly than seemed possible. The elderly custodian, Mr. Tanaka, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, crossed himself and murmured something in Japanese. Later, he would tell others about spirits called inugami from his homeland, dog spirits that were said to protect children and bring healing. At the time, nobody laughed at the idea. Dr. Kapoor pulled out his phone, documenting the extraordinary changes in Isabella's vital signs. His hands were shaking slightly as he recorded the readings. Everything he knew about medical science told him this shouldn't be happening, yet the evidence was right there on the screens. Through all of this, Lucia slept on, her exhaustion finally claiming her completely. Her face had relaxed into a peaceful expression, as if somehow knowing that her daughter was being watched over. The dog's humming continued, its golden eyes never leaving the tiny baby in the incubator. Security guards finally arrived at the unit's entrance, having been alerted about the dog's presence in the hospital. But even they stopped short at the threshold, sensing that they were witnessing something that shouldn't be interrupted. The head of security, a tough veteran named Officer Rodriguez, found himself removing his cap as if he had entered a church. The snow continued to fall outside the windows, creating a soft white curtain that seemed to separate this moment from the rest of the world. Inside the ICU, time seemed to stand still as the strange dog continued its vigil, its mysterious song weaving through the air like strands of golden light, bringing with it something that felt very much like hope. As word spread through the hospital about the mysterious dog in the ICU, more staff members gathered at the unit's large observation windows. They watched in amazement as the impossible unfolded before their eyes. The dog's gentle humming had transformed the usually quiet unit into a place of wonder. Little Isabella, who had been so still just moments ago, was now moving with more energy than she'd shown in days. Her tiny fingers curled and uncurled, reaching out as if she could sense her unusual visitor. The monitoring equipment told an incredible story. Her oxygen levels had risen from a worrying 82% to a healthy 98%. Her heart rate, which had been irregular, now showed a strong, steady rhythm. Dr. Kumar rushed into the unit, having been called by one of the nurses. He'd been treating Isabella since her premature birth, and his forehead had carried worried wrinkles for days. Now he stood beside the incubator, looking back and forth between his tiny patient and the mysterious silver-gray husky that sat beside her. He pulled out his stethoscope, listening intently to Isabella's chest. "This is remarkable," he whispered, not wanting to break the magical atmosphere that had settled over the unit. "Her breathing is stronger. The fluid in her lungs, it's clearing." He checked and rechecked the monitors, making notes in his tablet with trembling hands. In all his years of medical practice, he'd never seen anything like this. The dog's humming changed slightly, becoming deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to fill the room like warm sunlight, touching everyone present. Nurse Lai, who had been on her feet for 12 hours straight, felt her fatigue melt away. Mr. Patel, who had returned early to check on his twins, found tears rolling down his cheeks, though he couldn't explain why. Other babies in the unit began to respond too. The monitors throughout the room showed improved vital signs across the board. The usual crying that was common during this hour had ceased completely. Even the most fussy infants lay quietly in their incubators, small faces turned toward the singing dog, as if listening to a beloved lullaby. Through it all, Lucia remained asleep in her chair, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of the past few days. But her face had changed. The worry lines had smoothed out, replaced by a gentle smile. Her hand, still reached out toward Isabella's incubator, had relaxed from its usual tense position. The hospital's head pediatrician, Dr. Yamamoto, arrived with a team of specialists. They had rushed up from the emergency room after hearing about the extraordinary events taking place in the ICU. They stood in the doorway, medical training warring with what they were witnessing. Their whispered conversations fell silent as they watched the dog's golden eyes track each movement inside Isabella's incubator. A young resident pulled out his phone to record the event, but Dr. Kumar gently stopped him. "Some moments," he said softly, "are too special to capture on camera. Just watch." The resident nodded, understanding that they were witnessing something that went beyond medical science. The dog's song grew softer, more gentle, but its effects remained just as powerful. Isabella's monitoring equipment showed numbers that looked better than they had since her birth. Her skin, which had been slightly grayish, now showed a healthy pink color. Her chest rose and fell with strong, regular breaths. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly checking Isabella's vital signs, suddenly noticed something remarkable. The baby's hands, which had always been tightly clenched, were now relaxed and open. And there, on her tiny face, was something that looked very much like a smile. The snow outside had stopped falling, and the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky in gentle pinks and golds. The light streaming through the windows seemed to make the dog's silver fur glow with an inner radiance. Its song had become so soft it was barely audible, but the feeling of peace and healing remained strong in the room. Other parents in the unit had woken up now, drawn by the strange energy in the room. They stood quietly by their babies' incubators, watching in wonder as the mysterious visitor continued its healing vigil. Some held hands, others wiped away tears, but all of them felt the same thing. They were witnessing a miracle. The security guards who had come to remove the dog still stood at the entrance, their uniforms looking out of place in this moment of magic. Officer Rodriguez, who prided himself on handling any situation, found himself unwilling to interfere. Sometimes, he whispered to his partner, "You just have to have faith." As the morning light grew stronger, Isabella's vital signs continued to show improvement that defied medical explanation. The dog's golden eyes remained fixed on her, its gentle song weaving a bridge between the world of science and something far more mysterious. In this moment, in this room, the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary had disappeared entirely. The morning shift was arriving at St. Mary's Children's Hospital when Dr. Patel hurried through the main entrance, his white coat billowing behind him. He'd received an urgent call about unprecedented changes in the ICU, specifically about his tiny patient Isabella. As he rushed toward the elevator, he couldn't help but notice the strange atmosphere in the hospital. Staff members were speaking in hushed tones, exchanging meaningful looks, and some were even crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. "You need to see this," Nurse Lai had told him over the phone, her voice trembling with emotion. "We've never seen anything like it." Dr. Patel had treated thousands of premature babies over his 20-year career, but something in the nurse's voice made his heart race. He'd left his breakfast half-eaten on the kitchen table and drove to the hospital in record time. As the elevator doors opened on the ICU floor, he was met by a small crowd of medical staff gathered around the unit's observation windows. Specialists from different departments stood shoulder to shoulder with nurses, technicians, and cleaning staff. Everyone seemed drawn to whatever was happening inside. Dr. Patel made his way through the group, his colleagues parting to let him through. As he entered the unit, the first thing he noticed was the unusual silence. The NICU was typically filled with the sounds of medical equipment, crying babies, and busy staff. But now, a different kind of peace filled the air. And then he saw it. The silver-gray dog with golden eyes, sitting calmly beside Isabella's incubator. The animal's presence should have sent him into emergency mode. Dogs weren't allowed anywhere near premature babies, but like everyone else who had witnessed this strange event, he found himself stopping in his tracks. "Look at her numbers," Nurse Chen whispered, handing him Isabella's charts. Dr. Patel's eyes widened as he reviewed the readings. The baby's oxygen saturation had improved dramatically. Her heart rate was strong and steady. The chronic lung issues that had worried them for days showed significant improvement. He pulled out his stethoscope and approached the incubator carefully, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. The dog turned its golden eyes toward him, acknowledging his presence with a slight tilt of its head. As he listened to Isabella's chest, Dr. Patel had to check his stethoscope twice. The congestion in her lungs had cleared significantly. "Get me the previous x-rays," he requested, his voice barely above a whisper. A resident rushed to bring up the images on a nearby screen. Dr. Patel ordered a new chest x-ray, needing to document these incredible changes. As the portable x-ray machine was wheeled in, the dog remained perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of the procedure. The new images left the medical team stunned. Isabella's lungs, which had shown significant inflammation just yesterday, now appeared remarkably clearer. The comparison images side by side told a story that defied medical explanation. "This is impossible," murmured Dr. Wong, the respiratory specialist who had been consulting on Isabella's case. She adjusted her glasses, looking back and forth between the dog and the medical images. "The kind of improvement we're seeing, it should take weeks, not hours." The hospital's chief of pediatrics arrived, having been called in specially. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. "Document everything," he instructed quietly. "Every detail, every change in her vital signs. Whatever's happening here, we need to record it all." Medical students who had arrived for their morning rounds stood wide-eyed at the back of the room, frantically taking notes. Their textbooks hadn't prepared them for anything like this. One of them whispered to another, "Do you think this is what ancient people saw when they wrote about healing miracles?" The dog's humming had grown softer now, but its effects seemed to linger in the air like a gentle echo. Other babies in the unit continued to show improved vital signs. Parents who had been keeping vigil by their children's incubators reported feeling a deep sense of peace and hope. Dr. Patel found himself sitting down heavily in a nearby chair, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. In all his years of medical practice, he'd seen things that amazed him: the resilience of tiny babies, the power of modern medicine, the strength of the human spirit. But this was different. This went beyond science, beyond explanation. A young nurse approached him with a cup of coffee, her eyes shining with tears. "Dr. Patel," she whispered, Do you think we're watching a miracle?" He took the coffee with trembling hands, his medical training wrestling with what his eyes were telling him. "I think," he replied carefully, "we're seeing something that reminds us that there's more to healing than what we can explain with our instruments and medicines." He watched as Isabella moved in her incubator, her movements stronger and more coordinated than they had been since her birth. Lucia still slept peacefully in her chair, unaware of the extraordinary events unfolding around her. Someone had covered her with a warm blanket, and her face showed a peacefulness that hadn't been there in days. Soon she would wake up to find her daughter transformed, but for now, she rested while this mysterious guardian watched over her child. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long rays of golden light through the night hue windows. They seemed to catch in the dog's silver fur, creating an almost ethereal glow. Medical equipment beat softly, recording improvements that would soon become part of the hospital's most extraordinary case file. And in her incubator, little Isabella continued to grow stronger, watched over by golden eyes that held secrets science couldn't explain. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows as Mr. Tanaka slowly pushed his cleaning cart down the quiet hallway. He had worked the night shift at St. Mary's for over 30 years, but today felt different. His aged hands trembled slightly as he remembered what he had witnessed in the NICU, the mysterious silver-gray dog with those extraordinary golden eyes. As he worked, his mind wandered back to his childhood in a small village near Mount Fuji. His grandmother used to tell stories on cold winter nights, stories about spirit animals that walked between worlds to help those in need. "Not all angels have wings," she would say, her wrinkled face glowing in the lamplight. "Some have paws and come to us when hope seems lost." The memory was so vivid that Mr. Tanaka had to stop pushing his cart for a moment. He could almost smell his grandmother's green tea, could almost hear her gentle voice explaining the ancient beliefs about inugami, dog spirits that protected children and brought healing to those who needed it most. As he stood there lost in thought, Dr. Patel approached him. The doctor had noticed how the elderly custodian had reacted to the dog's presence earlier. "Mr. Tanaka," he said softly, "you seem to recognize something about our unusual visitor. Would you mind sharing what you know?" Mr. Tanaka hesitated, worried that his old stories might sound foolish to a man of science. But there was genuine curiosity in the doctor's tired eyes, and something else, a need to make sense of what they had all witnessed. "In my homeland," Mr. Tanaka began, his voice quiet but clear, "there are stories as old as the mountains themselves. Stories of guardian spirits that take the form of animals, especially dogs. They appear in times of great need, bringing healing and hope." His weathered hands gestured as he spoke, drawing pictures in the air. "They are said to have unusual coloring, silver fur, golden eyes. They move without sound, and their presence brings peace to troubled souls." A small group had gathered around them now, nurses and doctors pausing in their morning rounds to listen. Among them was Mrs. Lai, one of the senior nurses, who nodded slowly. "In China, we have similar legends," she added. "My mother used to tell me about divine animals that would appear in hospitals during times of great suffering, especially to help children." Dr. Patel ran a hand through his graying hair, thinking about the miraculous changes he had documented in Isabella's condition. "I've spent my entire career believing only in what science can prove," he said, "but what we saw today—" His voice trailed off, remembering the impossible improvements in his tiny patient's vital signs. A young resident spoke up from the back of the group. "My grandfather was a doctor in a small village in Mexico," she shared. "He once told me about a mysterious white dog that appeared at his clinic during an epidemic, staying with the sickest children. Those who saw it recovered in ways he couldn't explain." She smiled softly. "I always thought he was just telling stories to entertain us." Mr. Tanaka's eyes crinkled with understanding. "Perhaps," he said gently, "there are some things in this world that cannot be explained by modern medicine alone. My grandmother used to say that when science and magic meet, miracles happen." The group fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts and memories. Outside, the morning had brought a fresh blanket of snow, making the world look clean and new. Somewhere in the hospital, monitors beat steadily, showing little Isabella's continuing improvement. You know, Mrs. Lai said thoughtfully, every culture seems to have stories like this. Different details, different names, but always the same theme, helping spirits that appear when they're needed most. She adjusted her nurse's cap, a gesture that seemed to bridge the gap between the practical world of medicine and these ancient beliefs. Dr. Patel checked his phone, looking at the latest updates from the NICU. Isabella's vital signs continued to show remarkable improvement. Maybe, he said slowly, these stories have survived for so long because they contain a kind of truth we don't fully understand yet. A young nurse who had been listening quietly spoke up. My grandmother in the Philippines used to tell us never to chase away stray dogs that came to visit sick people. She said sometimes they weren't really dogs at all, but healing spirits in disguise. She smiled shyly. I never knew whether to believe her, but after today. Mr. Tanaka nodded, his eyes distant with memory. The old stories say these spirit animals appear only when the need is greatest, and only to those pure of heart, like children. He leaned on his mop, his face thoughtful. They say the spirits are drawn to the love of parents for their children, that this love creates a bridge between our world and theirs. The conversation was interrupted by excited voices from the NICU. Isabella had just had another checkup, and her improvement continued to amaze everyone. The medical staff hurried away to their duties, leaving Mr. Tanaka alone with his thoughts and his mop. As he resumed his work, he smiled to himself, remembering his grandmother's final words about these stories. The greatest magic in the world, she would say, is love. And sometimes, just sometimes, it takes forms we never expect. He looked out the window at the fresh snow, thinking about the mysterious visitor with golden eyes, and knew that today the old stories had come alive in the halls of St. Mary's Hospital. As the morning sun filled the NICU with golden light, Lucia finally began to stir from her exhausted sleep. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she felt disoriented in the quiet room. The first thing she noticed was the unusual silence, no beeping alarms, no rushing medical staff, just peace. Then she saw the dog. The magnificent silver-gray creature sat beside Isabella's incubator, its golden eyes fixed on her daughter. Lucia should have been frightened or at least surprised, but instead she felt an overwhelming sense of calm. Something about the dog's presence felt right, as if it belonged there. "Good morning," Nurse Chen whispered, approaching with a gentle smile. "Your daughter had quite an extraordinary night." She gestured toward the monitors, and Lucia's eyes widened as she took in the numbers. Isabella's oxygen levels were better than they'd ever been. Her heart rate was strong and steady. Lucia rushed to the incubator, pressing her hands against the clear plastic. Inside, Isabella looked different. Her skin had a healthy pink glow, and her tiny chest rose and fell with strong, even breaths. As Lucia watched in amazement, her daughter opened her eyes and moved her arms, showing more energy than she had since birth. "How?" Lucia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How is this possible?" Before anyone could answer, the mysterious dog stood up. It pressed its nose gently against the incubator one last time, and a sound like a soft lullaby filled the air. Isabella turned her head toward the sound, and for the first time since she was born, she smiled. Then, with the same silent grace that had marked its arrival, the dog turned and walked toward the NICU doors. Its paws made no sound on the floor, and its silver fur seemed to shimmer in the morning light. The automatic doors slid open, and just like that, the mysterious visitor was gone. The security team immediately checked the cameras, wanting to track the dog's exit from the hospital. But the footage showed something impossible. The dog simply vanished after leaving the NICU. Every camera in the building had captured its arrival, but none showed it leaving. It was as if it had disappeared into thin air. News of the miracle spread quickly through the hospital. Doctors documented Isabella's incredible recovery, though they struggled to explain it in medical terms. The improvements in her condition defied everything they knew about premature infant care. Other babies in the NICU who had been present during the dog's visit also showed remarkable progress. In the days that followed, Lucia noticed something strange. Sometimes, in the early morning hours when the world was quiet, she would catch a glimpse of something silver moving past the hospital windows. And on the day Isabella finally came home, she could have sworn she saw a pair of golden eyes watching from the hospital garden, but when she looked again, they were gone. Years passed, and Isabella grew into a healthy, happy child. She had a special love for dogs, especially ones with silver fur. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was full, Lucia would find her daughter standing at her bedroom window, smiling at something in the darkness. "The dog with the golden eyes," Isabella would say. "It still watches over us, Mama." The story became a legend at St. Mary's Hospital. New parents in the NICU would hear whispered tales of the mysterious visitor who brought healing when hope seemed lost. Some dismissed it as a folk tale, but others, especially those who had been there that night, knew better. The security footage from that remarkable night was carefully preserved, though it could never fully capture the magic of what had happened. Scientists and doctors studied Isabella's case, writing papers about spontaneous recovery and unexplained healing. But those who had witnessed it knew that some miracles couldn't be explained by science alone. On snowy nights, when the hospital halls are quiet and the moon casts long shadows, staff members sometimes report seeing a silver-gray dog with golden eyes walking through the pediatric ward. It never stays long, just long enough to visit the children who need it most. And in its wake, monitors show improved vital signs, pain eases, and healing seems to come a little easier. Mr. Tanaka, who still works the night shift despite his age, just smiles when he hears these reports. He keeps a small shrine in his home now, with a statue of a dog with golden eyes. "Some angels have paws," he tells anyone who asks about it. "And they come to remind us that love is the greatest healing power of all." As for Isabella, she grew up to become a pediatrician herself, working in the same NICU where her life was saved. On her office wall hangs a painting of a silver-gray dog with golden eyes, watching over a sleeping baby. When young parents ask about it, she tells them the story of her miracle and reminds them that hope can come in the most unexpected forms. And sometimes, on particularly challenging nights in the NICU, when the monitors beep urgently and worried parents keep their anxious vigils, staff members swear they hear a familiar humming in the air. They look up, hoping to catch a glimpse of silver fur or golden eyes, because they know now that some visitors don't need doors to enter, and some miracles don't need explanations to be real.